Welcome to our latest Wandering Walks of Wonder Walking Tour. Today we're taking a visit to northern Alabama to the very historic city of Decatur, Alabama. Decatur dates back to the town's settlement as far back as 1817, and at that time it was actually called Rhodes Ferry Landing after Dr. Henry W. Rhodes, an early landowner who operated the only ferry across the Tennessee River here in Decatur. In fact, our walk begins at Rhodes Ferry Park. The city was renamed Decatur in 1821 in honor of Commodore Stephen Decatur. After the naval hero was killed in a duel in 1820, President Monroe directed the town be named for him. Official incorporation of the town took place in 1826. With a bank, railroad, and river as drivers, Decatur began to grow between 1830 and 1860. However, the Civil War drastically changed the landscape of the community. Those strategic assets, the railroad and the river in particular, made the city prime real estate for Union and Confederate armies during the war. It's been estimated that the town changed hands around 8 times. In fact, in 1862, the Union troops took Decatur, evacuated the city, burned the railroad bridge, used wood from many structures to build their fortifications, and when leaving town in 1864, burned most of the remaining buildings. Our walk today will take us by many historic homes and buildings, the first of which we're seeing is the Carnegie building. This building itself was actually completed in September of 1904 and was one of about 2,500 libraries built by the railroad tycoon and millionaire philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. At the turn of the century, Carnegie began donating money to nonprofit educational organizations, starting with a large library system in Pittsburgh. Carnegie began to fund libraries throughout the nation. Decatur's Carnegie Library is a great example of one of the classic Carnegie buildings. Originally about 3,500 square feet and costing $8,500 to build, the building served as Decatur's library from 1904 until 1973, when it outgrew the facility and became the Children's Library. And then beginning in 1999, the Decatur Arts Council changed this into a visual arts center that was completed in 2003. Today, that center features local and traveling exhibits and is open to the public, and there's no admission charge. Before we see a few more homes, just to wrap up on the history of Decatur, after the Civil War, it took many years for Decatur to recover. One of the most important developments in the community's resurgence was the purchase by Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company of track that extended from Montgomery, Alabama to Nashville, Tennessee by way of Decatur. That occurred in around 1871. From then on, the city just continued to grow and prosper. As mentioned, after the Civil War, much of the town burned down, but one of only 4 houses remaining from that Civil War era is the Todd House. It was used then during the Civil War as a storage facility, so it was kept from being burned to the ground. The actual home itself dates back to 1836 when it was originally a 2-room Georgian house. The front door and side lights are very original to the house, although several additions have been made to the rear of the house. Today it is considered a hall and parlor style house with a hall that runs from the front door to the back doors with parlors opening off the hall. Just down the street is the Gibson House. This is a truly Victorian style home that was nominated as House Plant of the Year in 1900 for Home and Garden magazine. The home itself was built in 1901. It's hard to imagine, but for many years this house stood vacant and suffered from neglect and vandalism, but the bones of the house survived due to the quality of its materials and workmanship and has been meticulously restored. Here in the middle of the block on Lafayette Street are two single-story homes known as the Sears Kit Homes. If you look closely, although they're different colors, you'll see that they are identical style homes. These are Sears Kit houses and were purchased in 1910. Those kits, which were delivered by rail car, included everything, including floors, walls, windows, even the trim work both inside and out. The first complete Sears Kit homes were marketed by Sears and Roebuck in 1908, and eventually Sears offered over 370 different models of residential homes that ranged from small bungalows that cost about $500 per kit to larger homes costing over $5,000. Buyers of a Sears Kit home saved about one-third of the typical construction costs of the era. An instruction catalog was included, but to help make construction even easier, every piece of lumber was lettered or numbered. One of the best examples of what's known as the Second Empire style here in Decatur is the Mosley House. This house features a mansard roof, very beautiful double walnut doors, and floor-length windows. You also can note some of the Victorian era detailing around the porch as well as the roof line of the house. It was constructed around 1887 by Captain William Mosley, the largest property owner in town at the time. One of the most unique homes here in this historic residential district of Decatur is what's called the Fort Nash House. This house is a rare example of what is called the International Art Deco design. The house was designed in 1939 by the head of the architecture department at Auburn University and given as a wedding gift from Mrs. Nash to her daughter. The home features solid limestone walls with glass brick windows as well as accents. The circular entry leads to a semicircular room. The house has a full basement with a shuffleboard court and a glass brick bar with a full soda fountain inside. The Collier house was built after the town clerk, E.W. Collier, married a sister of the Leadinghams in 1885. We'll talk about the Leadinghams here in just a second with the house right next door. This two-story house shows Queen Anne influences in its design. And as mentioned, right next door is this charming small cottage that was built prior to 1875 for two maiden sisters, Rebecca Leadingham, who operated a private school while living there, as well as her sister Louise, who was a librarian at the nearby Carnegie Library that we saw earlier. We're now walking into the Japanese garden at Frazier Park. Frazier Park is named for a Decatur business leader who was instrumental in restoring old Decatur. On the west end of the park is a traditional Japanese garden made possible by a generous donation to the city of Decatur by one of its local industries, Deco American Corporation. One of the most beautiful and stately homes here in this historic neighborhood is the one known here as Shadowlawn. This stately white frame house surrounded by these towering oak trees inspired its name Shadowlawn. It was built around 1874 by Dr. William Gill. Gill was one of the oldest practicing physicians in the state of Alabama at the time, and he died attending patients during Decatur's last major yellow fever epidemic in 1888. Our tour now takes us past the John T. Banks Building. Civil War veteran, druggist, and early city leader John T. Banks built this brick structure in 1887. The building was at the center of a political storm in Morgan County in 1891, though. When a vote declared Decatur as the county seat, residents moved records serendipitously by horse and buggy at night from Summerville, Alabama. Originally 3 stories, the Banks building housed the courthouse for 2 years while a permanent courthouse on Ferry Street was being built. Later, the building housed a hospital as well as a retail store. After a fire in 1915, the 3rd story of the building was removed and mainly used for apartments until the 1970s. It was restored back in 2002 and is now office space. We're now heading down and going to be walking down Bank Street, which is part of the downtown Decatur Historic District. Most of these buildings that we see here date back to the 1800s, with some going up into the 1930s and maybe a little bit later after that. Many of these are commercial buildings and still used as commercial structures, retail businesses, and offices to this day. There are many historic churches in Decatur, one of those being First United Methodist Church. The sanctuary that we're looking at now was dedicated on Easter Sunday in 1899. There are 3 large stained glass windows in the church that cost at that time a whopping $450. The Methodist Episcopal Church South, as it was then known, raised a sanctuary as early as 1835 and was the earliest congregation in Decatur. That first building was a one-room brick structure. A later house of worship was burned by Union soldiers during the Civil War, but the federal government later reimbursed the congregation for the damage. In 1886, the Reverend John Harmon Nichols, a crippled veteran of the Confederate 16th Tennessee Volunteers, arrived and was determined to build a new church in Decatur. He kept that vow and built what was called then a neat little church, although you can see it's much bigger than that, and at that time it cost about $2,200. Our final stop on our tour here in historic Decatur, Alabama is the Old State Bank building. The Old State Bank was built in 1833 at a cost of $9,842. It opened that same year as a branch of the Alabama State Bank and was profitable until 1837. After the bank accumulated outstanding debts of over $1 million, its franchise was revoked and it closed in 1842. That failure was blamed on political shenanigans and poor lending practices, though an economic depression that struck in 1837 also played a part. The Old State Bank played a significant role in the influence and development of architectural style in Alabama until the Civil War by combining elements of the Federal style with the Greek Revival style. It is the oldest standing bank building in Alabama, and because the Union Army used the bank for a hospital, is one of just 4 buildings in Decatur that survived the burning of the town after the Civil War. In 1939, it was renovated and is now used as a museum as well as a civic hall. I hope you've enjoyed this Wandering Walks of Wonder tour here in this historic Decatur, Alabama. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and we will see you on our next Wandering Walks of Wonder walking tour. Take care now. Bye-bye.